experts from around the world to deepen our understanding and our love of the humanities, to explore diverse perspectives, and to ask for the big questions outside of class. Today's talk we're running in collaboration with, or we're co-sponsoring with the Conference on Philosophy in the Aristotelian Tradition. And let me just briefly tell you what to expect, and then I'm going to hand this microphone over to people who have more to say than I. You can expect our talk to be about 45 or 50 minutes long, and at the end we have Q&A, which runs until 4:45. And if you've been to one of these before, you know that a student has to ask the first question, so you should listen accordingly with sharp ears and an inquiring mind. The other thing we ask is that during the talk, those shiny screens that you've got staring at you, you close them down. Go back to the Stone Age. We've got pen and paper in your own two eyes. We'll post the talk to YouTube next week, so if you miss something, you can see it again. The last thing to note is when you get up and you boldly ask that question you're going to ask, just introduce yourself, name and major, wait for the microphone to get there so that your voice also rings through on the YouTube recording. Okay. I think that's everything from me. So now I'm going to hand this microphone over to Dr. Colin King, my colleague from the Philosophy Department, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's so nice to see all these students here on a beautiful Friday afternoon. What a testimony to your interest in philosophy. And maybe extra credit. No, maybe not. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks most of all to Jamie Leeds, who just arrived yesterday, Jamie Dow, who just arrived yesterday from Leeds. Sorry, his name is Jamie Dow, and he's from Leeds. Coming to us from the University of Leeds, where he's professor of philosophy, and he is also a professor at IDEA, Interdisciplinary Ethics Applied. Jamie is a great example for our students because he studied classics at Balliol College at Oxford and later went on into business. So all you people who are in the business school, you might consider actually first doing classics and then going into business. It can work that way. At least Jamie Dow collected some experience in management at PricewaterhouseCoopers and in the textile industry after his degree in classics. Then he went on to do a PhD on Aristotle, I think, in St. Andrews, with Sarah Brody, a very esteemed and now past colleague in ancient philosophy. I knew Jamie Dow primarily from his writings. He wrote a very important 2015 book on the passions and persuasion in Aristotle. And he's a good example of somebody who can use ancient philosophy and bring it to problems and questions of the modern world and make it not just relevant in some sort of superficial way, but really use ancient knowledge to understand how persuasion works in the present day. And that's why I'm really delighted to turn it over to him.
Thanks very much for having me. It's really great to be here. Thank you for such a lovely full room, and I hope that I'll be able to repay that interest in what follows. So I'm going to be talking about the emotions. Lots of people are interested in the emotions. Not so many people are interested in how the emotions feature in persuasion. And I'm mainly going to be talking to you about what Aristotle has to say about that, and some of that is the content from the book that Colin has just mentioned. But I want to set this, first of all, in context, and that's to do with the beyond bit. So beyond, I intend to mean extending right through to today. So what I want to show you just now is a couple of examples of how emotions play a dynamic and significant role in persuasion in the public sphere today. And I'm going to present a couple of examples, one from the UK, one from the US, that may be familiar to us. They are quite contested examples, and I intend them as examples of the powerful and significant use of emotion arousal within public persuasion here. because the examples are contested, I think maybe it's helpful to point out that I don't intend them. There's no further message intended in the use of these examples. So I'm going to start with a British one. So this is a very famous intervention in the campaign for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. And this man, Nigel Farage, was leader of the Leave campaign, and this breaking point poster was a very significant intervention. It purports to represent lines of immigrants that were at the gateway of the United Kingdom, perhaps, the gateway of the European Union, breaking point. It's an attempt to arouse fear in order to motivate UK voters to vote against the UK's membership of the European Union. Okay, so it's got a persuasive goal. It's aiming to work through fear. It presents this line, this large mass of sort of darkish-looking people, and suggests that the country is at breaking point. Second example of emotion arousal in the political sphere. They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets of the people who live in Springfield, Ohio. So this is, I mean, this for me has got to rank as one of the most bizarre bits of political discourse that I can remember in my lifetime. It's a clear appeal for a kind of disgust at Haitian immigrants in that particular context. So those are two examples of the deliberate cultivation of an emotion with a persuasive goal in the public sphere. And it's a tool that is familiar to us, and it's used because it's powerful and does have purchase with people like us. On the other hand, his photograph doesn't come through so well. So this is a Scottish politician that died actually a couple of months ago called Alex Salmon, very significant figure in Scottish politics, the leader of the Yes campaign in the Scottish referendum for independence in 2014. And he characterized the No campaign, so those who were opposing Scottish independence, he characterized their whole campaign as Project Fear. And you maybe have heard this expression used, and it's used to disparage the use of emotion in public persuasion. So what he was disparaging was those who suggested that Scotland would be financially disadvantaged through leaving the United Kingdom, those who suggested that Scotland was, say, too dependent on oil revenues, and that was a precarious foundation for Scotland's economic future. So that was the kind of thing that he was opposing, and he was opposing it by characterizing it as Project Fear. And the message, of course, in this kind of move politically is to say, look, emotions shouldn't be part of our political discourse. This is a desperate move on the part of my opponents, he's saying. They're appealing to emotion rather than reason. This is the wrong sort of thing to have in our political discourse. Emotions are not the right kind of way to be seeking to persuade people. So it's a kind of denigration of the use of emotion arousal in the public sphere. Okay, so I've given you two examples of people using emotions willingly, and here's somebody opposing the use of emotions. Now, these, of course, have their counterparts in the ancient world. So in the context that Aristotle is inheriting, you've got an Athenian background in which there have been periods of Athenian history with significant demagogues using their persuasive power, including the power of emotion, to persuade the voting public, the participative democracy of their point of view, and gaining power by doing so. So Lysias in the legal sphere, speechwriter, and politicians Alcibiades and Cleon. And as well as the practitioners, there were those who taught these skills. So you've got Gorgias and Thrasymachus, both teachers of rhetoric, for whom the power of emotion was a significant part of that, of their armory, that they made money by conveying those skills to other people. And the way they characterized their skills, so in Gorgias, the way he characterized the thing that he would be able to teach you is it's going to be like a kind of mighty dictator. So the power of speech to persuade, it's the power of a mighty dictator. And I will put that in your hands, he says. It's like the power of spells and incantations, things which have this mysterious ability to change things from a distance. We know not how. That's the power that rhetoric can give you. Or an image that both Thrasymachus and Gorgias like to use. The power of speech is like the power of a boxer or a wrestler or a fighter. Essentially, it's putting weapons in your hand that you can use as the orator to basically smash your opponents down. So we inherit a phrase from that period, a knockdown argument. So it's a wrestling metaphor, which this guy, Thrasymachus, used. Knockdown arguments was one of his phrases, right? And that endures to this day. So, in other words, what these people were offering to teach you was a set of skills that would give you power, right? And they could make a living by doing that. And that generated a reaction amongst the intellectuals. So you had, in slightly different ways, Socrates and Plato, but perhaps most obviously Socrates, disavowing any participation in the public sphere. He didn't go to the assembly, he didn't make speeches, and except on one famous occasion, his own trial, he didn't make speeches in the law courts. Because of seeing the skill that Gorgias and Thrasymachus were teaching as fundamentally dangerous. Okay, so in antiquity, you've got unscrupulous practitioners, you've got people who rejoiced in the power of persuasive tools, including emotional tools, and you've got a kind of backlash among the intellectuals against that. And Aristotle is going to be positioned sort of, as you might expect, sort of somewhere in the middle of that, and I'll explain how in just a second. But I want to point out that today there are also intellectuals wanting to position themselves in the middle. So here are three public intellectuals who want to point out that we should not be insisting on dispassionate communication in the public sphere. So these are three thinkers who want to defend a role for emotion, emotion arousal, and emotional methods in persuasion in the public sphere. So there's Misha Cherry, University of California, Riverside, and then in the middle, Iris Marion Young, late Iris Marion Young of the University of Chicago, and Martha Nussbaum. And these have all wanted to insist that it would be problematic to try and insist on norms for persuasion that exclude emotional methods. And the basic worry is that the more you insist on dispassionate modes of persuasion, the more you marginalize groups that are already disadvantaged. So I'm going to take Iris Marion Young as the sort of central case. So let's just look at some of the things that she says. A norm of dispassionateness dismisses and devalues embodied forms of expression, emotion, and figurative expressions. People's contributions to a discussion tend to be excluded from serious consideration, not because of what is said, but how it's said. Not because of what, but how. Norms of orderliness sometimes exclude disruptive or emotional forms of expression that can be very effective in getting people's attention and in making important points. The privileging of allegedly dispassionate speech styles, moreover, often correlates with other differences of social privilege. The speech culture of white middle-class men tends to be more controlled without significant gesture, expression, or emotion. The speech culture of women, racialized or ethnicized minorities, and working class people, on the other hand, often is, or is at least perceived to be, more excited and embodied, values the expression of emotion, uses figurative language, modulates tone of voice and gestures widely. So those are quotes from Young's book, Inclusion in Democracy. So I want to, so that the concern of those theorists is with politics. I want to kind of widen the lens a little bit further before kind of positioning Aristotle within this framework. So we can think about leadership through the same lens. I mean, I could have gone to advertising. I'm kind of interested, actually, as in my applied ethics work in the ethics of advertising. That's another area of application. But let's think about leadership. So a widely used textbook by Peter Nordhaus called Leadership characterizes leadership as follows. Leadership is a process whereby, well, I'm adapting this to say one or more people influences a group of others to achieve a common goal. So leadership in sport, in the military, in business, in charities, in the university setting is characterized in this textbook, very widely used definition, as a process of influence. Right? Leadership is about influencing others. And we can think about how that influence takes place. And here are some examples of people who, in thinking about organizational leadership, have pointed out how emotional tools are important in this domain as well. So here's an example given by John Cotter in this widely used book on leadership, particularly leadership in change management, leading change. So he tells a story of a manufacturing company. He doesn't say what it's manufacturing. I don't know, it might be laptops, might be coffee machines or clothing or something. And in their change program, the leaders of that change program said, right, and the point is, they weren't making cars, right? They were making something else. So think coffee machines, laptops, clothing. We're going to be making fewer Fiats and more Mercedes. Now, that's a way of characterizing their change program as a way of kind of attracting their staff to support it. It's a way of saying we're going to be aiming for something that will be better for our company. We're going to go for the high-end market. We're going to not make kind of basic laptops, basic coffee machines that help people kind of just get through the week. We're going to go for more high-end, high-spec products. We're going to be making fewer Fiats and more Mercedes. Right? It's a way of helping their staff to kind of feel good about a shift in their market direction. Here's another example. This guy, Lou Gerstner, headed up a major transformation in one of the globe's largest corporates, IBM. And part of his vision was kind of talking about elephants. So his book's called Who Says Elephants Can't Dance? And this was part of how he put across his change program. So the point is, IBM was seen as an elephant. And that's great in some ways. Big corporate, you get some economies of scale, lots of advantages to being big in the corporate world, but there are disadvantages to being big as well. You're not so agile. You can't respond to your customers' needs so easily. So in his terms, in general, elephants don't dance. Right? But what if they could? What if we could turn this elephant into an elephant that could dance? Right? What if we make IBM into an elephant that can dance? And if the elephant starts dancing, the ants had better get off the dance floor. In other words, we're going to beat both the big corporate competitors and the little competitors at their own game because we're going to get all the advantages of being huge and we're going to get the advantages of agility. Right, so this is his way of kind of selling internally to staff the vision for the company. And why does he talk about elephants and ants? Well, it's so that his staff can feel better, if you like, about the kind of change that's being proposed, so they can have a picture that can attract them of what that might look like. Okay, and I'm going to skip across a sporting example. There's perhaps a sort of rather lame excuse to put my football team's badge on the football team you haven't heard of that is now in the Premiership, possibly for one season only. Okay, but you know, if you want to ask me about leadership and persuasion within sports and how this applies to sports, I think that is an interesting area of application. Okay, I want to differentiate the kind of way in which Aristotle makes space for emotional persuasion from some of the things that we find in Nussbaum, Young, and Cherry. So in general, they are highlighting that emotions can be instrumentally useful for motivating action, particularly in social contexts where that really matters. They're also highlighting that it can be virtuous to feel emotions in certain kinds of contexts. And they're highlighting particularly Maisha Cherry, but the others as well, that emotions often express the right kind of values. So in Maisha Cherry's case, she's defending rage as an appropriate response that, as it were, reaffirms the worth of marginalized people. That by being angry, you are reaffirming the worth of those whose worth has been set less. Now, Aristotle, I think, is offering a different kind of justification for emotion in the public sphere. His justification, to summarize it, is going to be that arousing the emotions of others can be a way of giving them proof of the conclusion that you're trying to get them to draw. So it's a different kind of defense from what we see in these other theorists. Not incompatible, just a different line. So Aristotle has things to say on the emotions in all sorts of spheres of life. And these have been, you may have come across this in your studies. This is why Aristotle is somebody that people take an interest in when they get interested in emotion, because he thinks about how we should fit emotions into thinking about psychology, human psychology, rhetoric, biology, ethics and the good life, the virtues, politics, the role of emotions in political upheaval and revolution, and in literary criticism, so the arousal of pity and fear in tragedy. But I want to focus on the rhetoric bit. So here's a sketch of what Aristotle thinks about this. Irrelevant use of emotion to persuade is something that he pretty clearly rejects. But he does commend a different kind of use of emotion arousal where it can constitute proof. What are proofs? Well, they're arguments, bits of reasoning, or points that an orator might make. So I'm going to say a little bit about that just now. So let's say something about proofs. So here is a quote from near the beginning of Aristotle's Rhetoric. Aristotle says this: there have been a bunch of previous works with titles like Expertise in Public Speaking. Okay, that's the kind of book you might see on the shelves today. Well, there were works of that title in antiquity too. Previous writers of works titled Expertise in Public Speaking have told us hardly anything about that expertise. That expertise is an expertise in the provision of proofs, nothing else. All other aspects of speaking are ancillary to that. And they've told us nothing about how to make points. Well, that's the bulk of providing proof. Okay, so the expertise in rhetoric is an expertise in providing proofs. What these predecessors have spent most of their effort telling us is how to speak irrelevantly. Their main preoccupations, slander, pity, anger, and similar set-piece emotion plays of the kind they supply are irrelevant to the issue under consideration. They're a direct bid for the allegiance of the juror. Okay, so this is in the really the first page of his work on rhetoric. This is his dismissal of his predecessors and the kind of set-piece ways that they sought to teach emotion arousal. But he was going to defend a view of emotion arousal as one of three types of proof. So what is a proof? So here's Aristotle's answer to that, a sort of abbreviated version of the passage. A proof, so for the Greek people, a pistis, a proof, is a kind of demonstration. And the rhetorical version of a demonstration is making a point. Enthymema, or an enthymeme, if you like, more sort of crabby, old-fashioned type language. Okay, so proof is a kind of demonstration. Rhetorical version of a demonstration is like making a point in your speech. And making a point is a kind of inferential reasoning. And then he goes on to say, and given that this central skill of rhetoric is all about inferential reasoning, who might be your best teacher, I wonder? Maybe somebody like me, says Aristotle. This is why you need somebody like Aristotle to teach you about it, because rhetoric's about proofs, and proof is about arguments. Okay, so if the right kind of expertise in persuasion is about giving people proofs, and proofs are types of argument, and maybe in your kind of foundation year here, you've kind of gone through your, I don't know, philosophy 101 or whatever it is. What's an argument? Well, it's a set of statements such that the truth of the first ones of those statements taken together favors or gives support for, or possibly rationally requires, your acceptance of the truth of the conclusion, right? So it's a set of statements such that the premises provide support for the conclusion. And Aristotle's thought is that's what rhetoric is about. It's about giving people proofs which share all their essential features with arguments. So how do emotions fit into this picture? Well, I'm gonna sort of skip on a bit. Famously, Aristotle says that there are three types of technical proof. One is just explicitly giving arguments, but the other two are presenting the character of a speaker in certain ways so that you'll believe things. Maybe there's stuff which I might tell you, and if you think that I'm a credible speaker, you might just accept those things because I said so. Right? You don't know the reasons. I know that you assume that I know the reasons. Right. So character and emotion are two other types of proof. How can arousing somebody's emotions be a way of giving them proof? Right. That's a puzzle, I think. A puzzle which Aristotle seeks to answer. So he says this in his introduction to his treatment of the emotions. He says, things don't look the same to us when we feel allegiance to someone as when we're hostile, nor when we're angry with someone as when we're calm. They either look totally different or they at least look different in proportion. If you're feeling allegiance to someone, if you're kind of feeling a connection with them, that they're kind of one of your guys, if they're the defendant, then you'll think they committed no crime, or maybe a minor misdemeanor. But if you're hostile to them, it's going to be the opposite. Okay, that's from... So here's the idea. If you're feeling allegiance to somebody, what you feel is Cleanthes. He's got the right values. He likes the right stuff. We share the kind of things that we want in life, the things that we think are important. Cleanthes is one of the good guys. So when you're feeling allegiance, when you're feeling sort of warmth towards Cleanthes, you're kind of thinking of Cleanthes as one of the good guys. And then, if you like premise 2, it's kind of obvious. If Cleanthes is one of the good guys, well, good guys don't commit major crimes, right? So probably Cleanthes didn't do anything wrong. Does that make sense? There's an argument here of which the key premise, the first premise, is something that you might not just think, you might feel that Cleanthes is one of the good guys. Okay. Now this, I think, suggests a criterion that we might use for assessing different ways of arousing emotions to persuade people. And that criterion is the same criterion that we might use when assessing an argument. And in fact, there is a kind of underlying argument here. So we might assess arguments as to whether the conclusion, how well supported is the conclusion by the premises. Right? That's one of the ways in which we might assess an argument. And the other thing that we might do is we might ask, how good are the grounds that we have for believing the premises? Right? These are just the normal ways in which we'd evaluate any argument. In other words, if we've got really good grounds for accepting the premises and the conclusion follows by necessity from the truth of the conclusions, in other words, it's as valid can be, then we've got maximal support for our acceptance for of the conclusion. Indeed, we might be irrational to refuse to accept the conclusion. That's the thought. But of course, there can be good arguments that don't quite reach that standard. You might have pretty good grounds for your acceptance of the premises, and there might be a kind of probably knocking around in the argument. So, okay, maybe good guys do bad things sometimes. Nevertheless, if Cleanthes is one of the good guys, it's less likely that he did something seriously wrong. Okay, that would be the thought. So, and how does that give us a criterion for emotion arousal in persuasion? Well, the answer is that our emotions we can be justified in our emotions, and we can have emotions that are not very well justified. Right? We can feel warmly towards somebody on a flimsy basis, or we can have known them for years and really know their character deeply. Right? And if we know Cleanthes' character deeply and have known him for years and have a really good basis for thinking and feeling Cleanthes is one of the good guys, then we've got a justification for that premise, which, if the argument's a valid one, that justification transmits down to the conclusion so that we're justified in accepting the conclusion. Does that make sense? And that's going to give us a criterion for differentiating between bad emotional arguments and better ones, or worse emotional arguments and better ones. Ones where the where the premise is, where the emotion is not very well justified, and ones where the emotion is well justified. Okay, so and I'm going to skip some more bits. Maybe this is one point at which I do a character proof. Take my word for it. There's some justification for this in the text of Aristotle. What I want to try and do is illustrate how this might work in relation to the examples that we started with. So the thought in relation to Lou Gerstner and IBM is, if Lou Gerstner has given the IBMers good grounds for finding his vision of the future IBM attractive, So if he's given them good grounds for thinking, actually, IBM really could become a dancing elephant. It could it could stay huge, doesn't need to be broken up, but it could become agile, right? If that's an attractive vision for IBM, and if Lou Gerstner has given his staff good reason for finding that an attractive vision, then he's given them, he's put them in a position to be justifiably attracted to that vision for IBM and to draw the conclusion that he wants them to draw, which is that they should get on board with the program and help transform the organization in that way. If we have got good justification for being afraid of immigrants breaking the country by their arrival, right, if we're justified in being afraid of immigrants in the kind of way that this poster is trying to get us to be, then there will be a justified, well, then at least that part of the argument will be justified. Of course, there are a few steps between that and leave the European Union. But we've got a criterion here that we can apply. You know, how well does the argument work for to the conclusion Britain should leave the European Union, and the emotional step, we're afraid of an influx, a large influx of immigrants. If this is to be a good use of emotion arousal in public persuasion, it had better be the case that that emotion of fear is justified, right, when it's felt by Nigel Farage's audience. And of course, conversely, if there isn't good justification for that fear, then what's happening here is a kind of triggering of an emotion without justification. So you know, if this is a bad case, it's a bad case because it's working through an unjustified emotion. Does that make sense? Right, and how well we evaluate this particular gentleman and his appeal for disgust is going to depend on whether there actually are any Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, eating weird stuff. Right, and I mean this, you know, in a way this is sort of easy. It's a strange, it's a wacky example, but it looks like whatever else you think of Donald Trump, this is going to look like a pretty clear case of bad emotion arousal, right? Because it's resting on a bunch of stuff which is just known to be false. Right? Whatever the right attitude is towards immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, it does not rest on disgust at their diet of pets. Okay. Just as a kind of little footnotey thing, part of Martha Nussbaum's work is interesting for her suggestion that disgust is an emotion that is almost always inappropriate when directed towards other humans. And I think that's an interesting piece of work. So the pumpkin that you had outside for Halloween, 10 days later, when it's slimy and decomposed and stinking, right, that might be an appropriate object of disgust, right? But some group of fellow humans, on Martha Nussbaum's view, is, however they're characterized, not an appropriate object of disgust. Okay, how are we doing on the time front? Okay, great. I will. So what I've done so far, I've hopefully shown you that emotional persuasion is a live issue for us in organizational life, in academic life, in political life, in the public sphere, and that what Aristotle offers is a way of making sense of why it might be legitimate on occasions, indeed beneficial and right, to use emotional methods in our persuasive discourse, but not just, he's not giving a blanket sort of tick against all emotional methods. He's justifying the use of emotion in public persuasion in ways that imply criteria for how to do that better or worse, rightly or wrongly. And we've seen that applied to some of the examples. So I want to raise a further puzzle for the position that I've... so here we're more into areas that I'm interested in as a researcher and looking to kind of make sense of myself. So we're a little bit at the kind of boundaries of research here. Here's a puzzle. So back to Cleanthes. You get to show that probably Cleanthes is innocent in his trial by getting the jury to feel on good grounds that Cleanthes is one of the good guys. So you get them to feel a sense of allegiance towards Cleanthes by maybe showing them how Cleanthes is kind of on their side. His agenda in public life and in his life, in perhaps how he's lived it, has been he shares your values. He lives like you. He's one of the good guys. Right? So you start with evidence that Cleanthes is one of the good guys. You get people to feel a sense of allegiance towards him, and that functions as a premise that leads you to the conclusion that probably he's innocent. Okay. Now, here's a puzzle. Suppose that's what you need to do as a speaker at Cleanthes' trial in order to get your audience to conclude that he probably didn't do anything wrong. Why do you need the emotion? Right, that's a puzzle that you might pose here is, if you've got to do all the evidence stuff, if you've got to basically advance that kind of argument anyway, why do you need to make it really emotionally compelling? Why don't you just give people that argument? Here's the evidence, Cleanthes is one of the good guys, and however you feel about him, you can maybe accept rationally in your head that Cleanthes is one of the good guys. Why not just get people to run that argument in a dispassionate way? Why do you need to get people to feel that he's one of the good guys? If arguments and evidence required for emotional proofs include all of the same things that are required for ordinary argument proofs, why bother with the emotion part? Right? That's the puzzle. Here's what I think is Aristotle's answer to this. So he says this in Book 2 of the Rhetoric. Since rhetoric is for the sake of a judgment, political deliberations are judged, and a trial, a legal trial, is a judgment. It is not only necessary to take care that the argument is conclusive and trustworthy, you must also make yourself, as the speaker, have certain qualities and get the person judging into a certain condition. In other words, don't just do the logos stuff. You need to do the ethos, the character, and the pathos, emotion stuff as well. And that's because rhetoric is for the sake of a judgment. And then this is to the passage we looked at before, for it makes a huge difference to their being convinced, especially in political deliberations, but also in trials, to make the speaker appear to have certain qualities, and for them to take him to be disposed a certain way towards them, and in addition, if they are themselves in a certain emotional state. So it makes a big difference to people's being convinced if you can make yourself out to have a certain character, and if you can get people's emotions aroused. For things don't look the same to us when we feel allegiance to someone as when we're hostile, nor when we're angry as with somebody as when we're calm. They either look totally different or different in proportion. Okay, that actually was the bit that I read earlier. So what's his answer? I think his answer is basically that emotions change our cognitive outlook. this is the sort of first part of the explanation as to why we need the emotions, not just dispassionate arguments. So here are 3 things that Aristotle says. Public persuasion is about getting people to a judgment. And maybe the thought is here that in a law court or a political assembly, what that's about is getting people actually then to do something. They've got to actually vote as the jury in a trial, and in the political assembly, they've got to vote for a particular policy. They're going to have to actually make their minds up and do something. And that's different from just, as it were, assenting to the conclusion of an argument, maybe. So the thought is that there's this kind of practical, action-focused thing that your listeners are going to have to do. And emotions make a big difference to being convinced because they affect your overall cognitive outlook. And you can sort of see that. I mean, I haven't expressed that as a kind of tight argument, but you can see there that there's a kind of explanation that Aristotle is offering for why it's important to do the emotional and character stuff and not just the dispassionate argument stuff. But I want to try and flesh out exactly how that explanation works. And to do that, I'm going to draw on a couple of other passages that he, in which he explains to the orator how to use emotion in practical contexts. So he's talking about indignation. In other words, being righteously indignant that somebody's doing really well when they don't deserve it, right? So whoever your best picture is of undeserving rich, right? Maybe some rich people are deserving, right? Doubtless that's true, but probably none of us would deny that there are some people who are rich, doing well, all's going well for them, and they don't deserve it, right? We can probably all think of at least one person like that. And if you feel indignant at that, that's what Aristotle's talking about when he's talking about indignation. If the speech can put the judges into a position where maybe the defendant in a trial is somebody they feel indignant at, they're doing well and they don't deserve a bit of it, then even those who think they deserve to be pitied, right, perhaps because of what they're alleging they're the victim of in the trial, they think they deserve to be pitied, and in regard to what they think they deserve to be pitied for, if the speech shows that they do not deserve it and in fact deserve not to be pitied, it will be impossible to pity them. What Aristotle's saying here is that if you can get people to be indignant at how well somebody is doing, it's going to be really difficult for the opposing side to get the jury to pity them. In other words, indignation blocks pity. Here's another example. If the judges, the jury, can be got into this condition of feeling envious of somebody, right? They're just like me, and they got a lucky break. You know, damn them. I was just as good as them, but it all turned out brilliantly for them and not so well for me. Right, so the circumstances in which we envy those who are in a similar situation to us, but it's turned out like much better. If we can get the jury to envy somebody, those who think they deserve to be pitied or receive some benefit can be made, as we've mentioned, i.e. made out to be just like us but enjoying greater good fortune. It's obvious that they're not going to get pity from the judges. So in this way, sort of the idea is that if you can arouse certain emotions, they block your opponent's argumentative strategy. And why do they work so well? I think we've got some material in Aristotle to explain this as well. Emotions are attention hungry. So the idea here, I think, is that because when we're emotionally aroused, when we're feeling passionate about something, when we're feeling we really identify with somebody perhaps, and we really feel for Cleanthes, or we're really indignant at how undeservedly somebody is prospering, whatever emotion it is we're feeling, we tend to be fixed. Our attention tends to be fixed on whoever it is that's the object of our emotion and the respects in which they are the object of our emotion. And Aristotle says some things about pleasure. So the emotions for Aristotle involve pleasure and pain. And an activity, he says, is intensified by its proper pleasure, since each class of things is better judged of and brought to precision by those who engage in the activity with pleasure. In other words, or for example, if you really enjoy geometry, you're going to concentrate on it much better. You're going to be able to focus on your work and keep doing it, even when you're getting tired. Those are the people that grasp the propositions of geometry better. If you're fond of music, if you really enjoy music, right, you're going to be better at practicing. Right, you're going to do more practice because you enjoy it. You're going to pay attention more. And this is apparent from the fact that activities are hindered by pleasures arising from other sources. Actually, this is a kind of curse for me. I really enjoy music, so much so that I basically can't do much else if there's music going. So I know lots of people study and do their research to music, right? I can't do that. If I try and do that, basically, I just listen to the music. I don't do any work. If I'm in conversation, right, and something comes over the music that's got any kind of musical interest to it, I've really got to work hard to concentrate on the person that I'm talking to. It's not, music's a blessing, isn't it? But I feel this, People who are fond of playing the flute are incapable of attending to arguments if they overhear somebody playing the flute, since they enjoy flute playing more than the activity in hand. So the pleasure connected with flute playing destroys the activity concerned with argument. Right, I can testify to that firsthand, or to something very similar to that. And this happens similarly in all cases when one is active about two things at once. The more pleasant activity drives out the other. And if it is much more pleasant, it does so all the more. That's why one ceases from the other. This is why when we enjoy anything very much, we do not throw ourselves into anything else and do one thing only when we're not much pleased by another. In other words, and in the theatre, the people who eat sweets do so most when the actors are poor. Right? If the actors were good and you were really enjoying the play, right, you'd forget about your sweets. Right? You'd forget about the popcorn. Right, because you'd be totally engrossed in the pleasure of the play. So the thought here is that the passions are attention hungry, and this helps to explain why it's particularly significant when we're using them persuasively. In other words, if you can launch an argument that has all of the logical features that I was identifying earlier, that it involves justification for the emotions that it makes people feel, and that provides justification for the conclusion that you're getting people to, that you want them to adopt, that's going to be particularly significant because it's going to occupy people's attention, and it's going to make it hard for the next speaker to dislodge your focus on all of the things that make Cleanthes a good guy. Right? If I've got you really feeling for him, it's going to be hard for you to lose sight of all of the reasons why he's a good guy and why he probably didn't commit the crime. Right? It's going to make it sticky, if you like, in your psychology, the argument that I might have presented to you emotionally. Okay, so the thought here is that emotional proof is hard to dislodge. So I've tried to position Aristotle as somebody who is critical of the wrong kind of use of emotion arousal, badly justified emotion, irrelevant emotion, emotion that doesn't give you good grounds for accepting the conclusion, but he's commending in its place the use of emotion arousal in persuasion where it constitutes proof. Justified emotions render conclusions inferred from them justified, and that gives us the criteria that we need for distinguishing good cases from bad cases. And it's important because of, if you like, our complex psychology. We are able to respond to situations both dispassionately through explicit cogitation, but also through these kind of more heartfelt forms of response, which are themselves intelligent because we've got this complex psychology, because we're disposed to fix our attention more on things that we feel either pleasure or pain or emotionally aroused towards. That helps to explain the importance of the emotions in persuasion. Okay, those are my conclusions. I think they constitute good grounds for taking an interest in Aristotle, in what he has to say about emotions, and not just in relation to virtue and the good life, or in relation to drama and tragedy and pity and fear, but in relation to the public sphere and how that might work, not just in antiquity, but in business, in sport, and in politics today. I think we're at questions.
Thank you very much, Jamie Dow. The first question is from a student. First questions can be from students. So hand in the back.
Sorry, I know I'm supposed to say my name. I'm Arthur. I'm a humanities major. So I was wondering if the emotional argument has left the truth and won't tolerate the dispassionate, what happens? I hope that makes sense. It's a little using your terminology, but.
So is your worry about the misuse?
So if the emotional sort of side
Yeah.
doesn't represent the truth
Yeah.
and won't tolerate or deems that those using dispassionate arguments as racist or play on emotions to deem that argument illegitimate, what happens to the truth, and how is what then you just live in an emotional world and not one based on truth?
Yeah. So I think there's a kind of way this could go that would be problematic. I mean, I'm guessing you're alluding to a very polarized political environment that is our world, that's full of this kind of thing. Let me use my nice, safe, antiquity-based example. So the thought might be that if there's a level of emotional fixation that you can generate in Cleanthes' proposed good qualities that makes it so impossible for your audience to consider any other relevant facts, then you might succeed in emotionally closing their minds to relevant evidence within a trial. I think there's an issue here which Aristotle doesn't close the door to, but he doesn't directly address, which is an ethical issue about how much attention fixation is too much, and what the ethics, if you like, what the ethics of attention direction are. And I think any position for Aristotle that we might come up with is one that we construct on his behalf from scattered materials in his corpus. But I take it that what we want to say about what a set of jurors should do in a trial, or what a set of active citizens should do when it comes to vote, is such that they should be open to all relevant evidence, all evidence that's relevant to the truth or falsehood of the claim under discussion. So is Cleanthes guilty or innocent, or to the political options under discussion. Now, one of the things that citizens need to be able to do within this is to do some kind of filtering and prioritizing, And it should be the case that our emotions are part of the mechanism that we have for prioritizing and fixing on these kinds of things. But it is true that they can be hijacked in ways that kind of get us over-fixated on one or another issue and not sufficiently open to other. So there's a kind of way in which you go past the good point, in which you're using this to pick out something that's really important for the trial, namely Cleanthes' track record of good character, maybe, and his good values, something like that. And you go past that to being so fixated on it that you're close to other stuff. Is that getting at the kind of things that you're...
Well, I would just worry about like emotions like driving a sort of like tribal nature, and where you can't make any progress with them, and that's the worry of the use of emotion in the sort of public sphere.
Yeah, I mean, so I suppose what I'm inclined to reply to that is that shouldn't lead us to eliminate emotion from the public sphere. It should lead us to apply criteria that might be criteria to do with justification and to do with openness to relevant evidence. If you like, all of the normal stuff that we might learn in epistemology 101 or civics 101 about kind of deliberation and evidence and so forth. I mean, just one little footnote on this is, of course, in trials and in political deliberations, we don't have direct access to the truth. So what we're trying to do is find out the best answer we can based on the evidence that we've got.
I would just worry about like the making the jurors allegiant to the defendant in a way that makes them not see the truth. Is kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Well, that would be a misuse. I take it you want the model that's being proposed here is their allegiance should be proportional to the evidence, and that makes their justification for feeling the way they do about Cleanthes only as good as the evidence that supports it, and the justification that transmits to the conclusion is only as good as that.
Thanks so much. Raymond Hain, Philosophy and Humanities. Thanks for your presentation. I have kind of two parts to my question. One is clarification, and the other is maybe a proposal or question. So the clarification, if I'm understanding correctly your presentation, emotions don't have any intrinsic connection to truth. That is, it looks like if we could just get rid of them, we would be better reasoners. They might correct for one another, they might motivate us to act, but they have no actual intrinsic connection to truth. So that's the first half. Is that your position? And then the second half is, if it is your position, maybe that's not right. And I'll just say, so King Lear in Shakespeare says, "I see it feelingly." And there's various reasons he says that in the play, but one thing it might imply is that there's such a thing as emotional intelligence. Yep. And I take it that one of your, and forgive me for not remembering her name, but the woman you quoted at the beginning, she's actually, I think, offering an argument for emotional intelligence that doesn't just convey evidence that's already been identified, say, rationally, but is actually a source of truth in some sense.
Yeah, so I'm so there's a way I'm wanting to kind of navigate some scholarly controversies here. But look, here's a way of thinking about emotions that they can be a bit like beliefs, right? So do beliefs have a connection with truth? Well, one of the things that we should be trying to do is get our beliefs to be true. And you might think that what we should be trying to get our emotions to be is accurate in relation to their objects. Now, little scholarly footnote. There are other respects in which emotions are not belief-like, but the thought would be they are themselves intelligent responses to our environment. And so the idea that, as it were, we see something feelingly, so the content of what we see can be something that's invested with, so I think there's a couple of, there are a couple of things in play there. One is the idea that we might immediately be emotional in our perception of aspects of our environment or about things we come to know about our environment or things we come to believe about our environment. So that I think is uncontroversially part of the picture that I'm canvassing as Aristotle's view. So if you like, emotions are intelligent responses that are tightly connected with how we see our environment. So there's a further stage, though, which is something like the thought that the emotions themselves are kind of extra perceptual apparatus that enable us to see things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to see. In other words, they respond to evidence that isn't available either to our senses or to our reason. Okay, and I don't think that's Aristotle's position. So let me give an example, a sort of everyday example of this that I think maybe would illustrate how I would want to position this sort of view. And I'm partly kind of speaking of sort of my own Aristotle-based view here rather than perhaps exactly anything that's in Aristotle. So suppose somebody comes to the door, to your front door, selling something, and they want to come in and explain their product to you or talk to you about the cause that they're canvassing for. And you can't put your finger on why you don't trust them, but you don't trust them. You feel there's something fishy about the person at the door, and it doesn't seem right. Something's not right with what this person purports to be about. It doesn't quite seem to add up. Now, one way of reading that is, I've got all my senses, and I've got my reason, but there's information coming to me in ways that aren't coming to me via my senses or via my reason. It's coming to me via this sixth sense, which is my emotions getting going. Now, if that's the picture that's being suggested, I don't really want to buy that because it sort of suggests some sort of extra, that emotions constitute a kind of extra sixth sense. What I think is going on there is something to do with our processing of the information which is available to us via normal methods. In other words, our emotions are helping us to process the information that we're getting via our senses, that there's something there that we haven't been able, as it were, in our explicit cognition to put our finger on, but which our more automatic processes are able to interpret as evidence that the person at the door is a bit dodgy or untrustworthy or something like that. So this is a way, I don't think this is a way of rejecting emotional intelligence. I think it's a way of vindicating and explaining it, actually, but without appealing to mysterious psychological faculties, but by kind of saying, no, there's stuff going on internally which is just using all our normal faculties of sense perception, things we know, things that we know in the back of our minds, and because our emotions are sort of quick and dirty, they're sometimes able to get to good conclusions faster than our reasoning capacities can quite put our finger on things. And incidentally, because they're quick and dirty, they sometimes get things wrong, right? So sometimes we end up trusting people because of how they look or because of how they sound. There can be all sorts of kind of bad ways in which our emotions get going particularly in relation to trustworthiness. So we tend to trust people who look cute more than we trust people who don't look cute, right? That just looks like it's our emotions latching onto something that's mostly irrelevant to trustworthiness, right? So they move fast, and they sometimes get it right, but they don't always get it right. Sorry, I should have made the answers shorter.
My name is Liam. I'm a grad student here in the business analytics program. I appreciate you coming here and sharing some of what you have learned throughout your studies. So my question is, do you think that most politicians, or if we want to be more general, public speakers are actively thinking about using emotion in trying to persuade their audience? Or do you think that it's more of like a subconscious thing where they're just speaking on their emotions, and in consequence of that has an effect on their audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. These are all great questions. There's no contrast implied there. Yeah, so I think that certainly within politics, politicians do think a lot about what kind of connection, what kind of response they're looking to achieve from their audience. And I don't know whether there are good generalizations to be had. It's certainly, it's certainly something that's got a kind of political premium attached to it if you can convey a sense that you really identify with the people that you're talking to, or that you feel the emotions that you're expressing and seeking to arouse in others. I think that at any given moment, that's just going to vary, isn't it? I mean, so we do tend to value authenticity in speakers, and that's partly because we're assessing their character and their motivation, as well as their arguments and what they present. So there's a high premium on speakers trying to give the impression that they feel all the stuff deeply that they say. It seems pretty impossible that could be true, even 90% of the time. But I think it's also worth kind of pointing out that in the kind of picture that Aristotle is presenting, you don't need yourself to be experiencing the emotions that you are seeking to arouse in the audience in order for that to be the right kind of emotional proof, right? What it depends on is whether you're actually giving the audience good reasons that would justify them in feeling that way, and so that none of that mechanism depends on whether you yourself are feeling that emotion. There might be things to do with whether you're a good leader of a movement, as to whether you sufficiently care about the right sorts of things. And that applies, of course, in sport, in the military, and in organizational life, and in religious communities as well. You want people as leaders who care about the staff, who care about members of the community, and for whom those things really matter at an emotional level. So that, in some ways, those things kind of get mixed up, because sometimes what you're trying to do in positions of leadership is get people to trust you on the basis that you care about the right kinds of things, including about them and what they care about. So sometimes that, I know that's a kind of mixed answer to your question. Those issues are often woven together, what the speaker is feeling and what they're trying to get the audience to feel. But I think there's no, in principle, reason why they can't on occasions come apart, and quite legitimately so.
Okay, great, thanks. Thanks so much, Jamie. Sarah Jane Murray, I met you earlier. I'm visiting too. I'm really interested in your work on applying this to advertising. You mentioned earlier, so maybe we can sort of end there. And given what we know in modern science today about how right Aristotle was about the way emotions act as like sticky save buttons in our brains. I wonder what you think about Aristotle's emphasis on this pistis, is this idea of good faith, not breaking good faith with the audience, and some modern advertising campaigns that might morally mislead purchasers. So one example that comes to mind is this really famous diamond campaign in the United States that was highly effective. It sold more of this brand's diamonds than they had sold at Christmas in like decades, I think maybe 20 years. It's a very unfortunate campaign. It also led to massive upticks in Middle America of depression and even self-harm and attempts of suicide. Was it a success? To me, no. But for the stakeholders, in terms of shares, yes. And it went something like this. It was a series of billboards. And it was basically like, feeling lonely this Christmas? If you'd bought her this diamond, she would have said yes. What would Aristotle say about that?
Yeah, so, we've got an argument up on the screen. I take it there's an emotional appeal, and the question is the ad, well, so, I mean, little footnotey point, I don't think pistis is about good faith or breaking good faith with the audience. It's about whether you provide proof, whether you've provided appropriate grounds for the audience to be convinced. So that's the sense in which it's being used in the rhetoric. But I think there's a kind of way in which there's a couple of things which might be wrong in that ad. One is it's not providing good proof, right, because it maybe rests on a falsehood, or certainly on a premise that it hasn't established or hasn't been reminding. There isn't evidence there that it's using that justifies the emotion that then gets the audience to buy the diamonds, right? So it just looks like it's going to fail Aristotle's tests that I've been presenting. And I mean, it's worth saying in advertising, there can be all sorts of other harms that go, right? So this is not the only criterion that you might use to evaluate a good or a bad advert. So adverts that entrench harmful stereotypes, for example, they might give perfectly good reasons to buy the product, but they might incidentally cause serious harm because of the particular methods that they use. But that's another sort of dimension to advertising ethics.
Please join me in thanking Jamie Dow.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Have a good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming.